by the time I got up above the bombers, I looked around and there were fighters all over the place. I've never seen this many airplanes in the air at one time before in my life.
Most pilots would call it impossible. Phillip Adair didn't. He took off for what he thought would be a routine mission, only to suddenly find himself staring down 64 enemy aircraft alone.
I called control and said, I'm going to make an attack and try to fire enough rounds in the front part of them to distract their attention about the time they're trying to drop their bombs.
No backup, no time to think, just him, his plane, and a sky filled with Japanese fighters ready to wipe him out. This is the story of the split-second decision, the insane maneuver, and the kind of raw courage that left even the U.S. Air Force stunned. The alarm that should have sent a squadron. The early morning of December 13, 1943, didn't start with chaos. It started with tension. This was the China-Burma-India theater of World War II, one of the most dangerous and fragile fronts of the entire war. Everything the Allies were doing here depended on a thin thread of air power. A handful of airfields in Assam and northern Burma were all that stood between survival and collapse. From these fields, transport aircraft flew constant supply missions over the Himalayas, a brutal route known simply as the Hump. If those airfields were knocked out, the supply line died with them, and the Japanese knew it. In the weeks leading up to that morning, Japanese air raids had already torn through the region. Dozens of Allied transport planes had been destroyed on the ground before they ever had a chance to take off. More than 100 personnel had been killed. Each successful raid proved the same lesson over and over again. If the response was slow, or worse, uncoordinated, the losses were devastating. There were no second chances out here. So when warning systems picked up a large inbound formation just before dawn, it set off an immediate alarm. This wasn't a test run. It wasn't a small fighter sweep meant to harass defenses. Everything about the reports pointed to a full-scale raid aimed directly at airfields and the fragile supply infrastructure that kept the theater alive. U.S. air combat doctrine was very clear in situations like this. You didn't send one fighter. You didn't gamble on bravery. You scrambled multiple aircraft, attacked in coordinated waves, and overwhelmed the bombers before they reached their targets. Anything less was reckless. Then the sirens began to scream across the airfield. Ground crews dropped whatever they were holding and ran. Pilots sprinted across the dirt, boots kicking up dust as engines roared to life on runways carved straight out of jungle. The airfield snapped awake in seconds, every man moving with the same urgency. Get airborne before the bombers arrived. Phillip Adair climbed into his P-40 Warhawk expecting exactly that. Support. Wingmen. A formation formed up beside him as they climbed. At the very least, a fighting chance. There was no time for hesitation. Every second mattered. Adair pushed the throttle forward and lifted off immediately, knowing that delay meant the enemy would reach the airfields uncontested. As he climbed, scanning the sky and waiting for familiar shapes to rise beside him, one realization hit harder than the engine's vibration. There was no one else. No other fighters climbing to meet him. No squadron forming up behind. No radio chatter signaling backup on the way. The sky around him was empty, except for the distant formation ahead. And as he continued to climb toward the approaching enemy formation, the numbers ahead became impossible to ignore. What he was about to face was something far colder than that. A statistical certainty of death. Why 64 enemy planes meant certain death. When Phillip Adair climbed alone toward the distant formation, he still did not understand the full scale of what he was flying into. The core of the formation was made up of Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally medium bombers, the aircraft the Japanese used when they wanted to wipe out runways, fuel depots, and supply hubs in a single blow. These bombers carried heavy payloads, flew in tight defensive groups, and relied on formation fire to tear apart anything that came near them. But the bombers were only half the threat. Flying with them were Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar fighters, fast and aggressive escorts whose only job was to keep the bombers alive. The Japanese did not send escorts casually. They arranged them in layers that made the formation almost impossible to penetrate. Some Oscars flew above the bombers, ready to dive straight onto any attacker. Others flew below to block escape routes. More fighters circled the sides to push intruders directly into the heaviest defensive fire. This structure created a moving trap with no safe angle of attack. It meant that any pilot who approached the bombers had to survive the escorts first. If he somehow made it through the fighters, he then faced multiple bomber crews firing in coordinated bursts. That is how the number 64 was reached. It was roughly 24 bombers supported by 3 to 4 squadrons of fighters, all arranged to protect one another. For a full American squadron, this was a dangerous mission. For one man in a single P-40, it was suicide. Adair had no wingman, no formation, and no altitude advantage over a coordinated enemy. That's crucial because altitude in air combat is life. It gives you energy, speed, and flexibility, all the things you need to survive and to strike. Without it, you're at a massive disadvantage. The P-40 itself was a capable aircraft in the right situation, but it had limitations. It was heavily built and more durable than many fighters, but that ruggedness came with a trade-off: less agility at high altitude than lighter Japanese fighters, especially those Oscars circling above. The Warhawk also had a slower climb rate, meaning it couldn't quickly gain the height needed to dive into or away from an enemy formation. And while its guns were effective, it carried only a limited supply of ammunition, roughly enough for about 12 seconds of continuous firing, a tiny window in the chaos of aerial combat. Japanese escort doctrine of the time played right into these weaknesses. Their fighters were trained to let bomber defensive fire distract a lone attacker, then swarm from multiple angles once the attacker was committed. If one fighter dove in alone to try to break the bomber box, others were already positioning themselves above or below to strike once the lone plane was isolated. Faced with impossible numbers, the question was no longer about skill. It was about the kind of man who would still press forward and the life that had trained him to do exactly that. Forged in Burma, the pilot, and the life that removed hesitation. Phillip Adair didn't suddenly become fearless in the skies over Burma. The kind of man who could look up at overwhelming odds and just act had been shaped long before the alarms ever sounded in the jungles of India. He grew up in Depression-era Oklahoma, a place and a time when scarcity was normal and hesitation could mean being left behind. Kids back then learned early that opportunities were few and second chances were even fewer. You didn't stop to think, you just did. That instinct, born from hard times, would stay with him into the cockpit years later. When the United States entered World War II, Adair enlisted in the Army Air Forces and began flight training in 1942, graduating as a second lieutenant before deploying overseas. Wartime flight school wasn't leisurely or gentle. It was fast, demanding, and designed to weed out doubt before a pilot ever got near the front. Student pilots were pushed hard, taught not just how to fly but how to decide and act. There was no room for hesitation when lives depended on the split-second choices of a young airman. After training, Adair was assigned to the 80th Fighter Group, later known as the Burma Banshees, one of the toughest postings in the U.S. Army Air Forces. The 80th had a reputation for biting off hard missions in the China-Burma-India theater and making them work. They were the first U.S. fighter unit to air operations in Burma after the Allied retreat, and were tasked with protecting the vital supply routes over the hump and supporting ground forces pushing north. But the CBI wasn't a comfortable place to learn combat. Airstrips were hacked out of jungle or mud, barely wide enough for takeoff, and once the monsoon hit, visibility could drop to nothing in minutes. The weather alone destroyed aircraft and shredded confidence. Heat and humidity clung to men like a wet blanket. Insects buzzed constantly, and disease was as real an enemy as the Japanese forces. Airfields were sometimes little more than tents and bamboo, and every day daily life for pilots meant constant alerts, scrambles at all hours, and flying missions even when tired, dehydrated, and stressed. There was nowhere to rest on laurels, and complacency was fatal. Maintenance crews did their best, but perfection was impossible. Aircraft often flew with patched holes and engines were pushed beyond their safest limits. A pilot learned quickly that his gear might not be pristine, but the mission didn't wait. You flew anyway. In that environment, hesitation wasn't just unhelpful, it was deadly. The rule on the ground and in the air was simple. You act immediately or you die. That rule became internalized. With every mission, every scramble, every buzz of enemy fighters overhead, hesitation faded. Decisions once weighed and second-guessed became instinctual reactions. By December 43, when the alarm sounded over the Assam airfield and Adair climbed into his P-40 Warhawk, he wasn't just a pilot. He was a product of unrelenting pressure and relentless mission tempo. By that point, he had already flown numerous combat missions, seen raids strike airfields, and felt firsthand what delay or indecision cost. Those months in Burma had shown him what raids did to airfields, to transport planes, to fellow pilots and ground crews. He understood the price of hesitation because he had lived it. Every early morning scramble, every monsoon-soaked takeoff, every close call in the skies trained him to act first and think later, because there often wasn't time for the opposite. That conditioning mattered now because at altitude, alone above a formation of enemy aircraft that would make most pilots retreat, Adair had only seconds to decide whether he would live cautiously or act, the split-second decision that broke all rules. As Phillip Adair closed in on the approaching Japanese formation, his eyes kept scanning the sky for something, anything familiar. A glint of metal, a wingtip, a friendly silhouette climbing to join him. He checked his radio again. Nothing. No chatter, no call signs. Just static and the steady vibration of his P-40 cutting through thin air. The sky around him was empty in the worst possible way. It didn't take long for the truth to settle in. He wasn't early. He wasn't ahead of the pack. He was it. The only interceptor between a full Japanese strike force and Dinjan Airfield, one of the most critical hubs supporting Allied supply flights over the Himalayas. If he waited, even briefly, the bombers would reach their target untouched. And once they were over the field, it would be too late to stop what followed. Everything he had ever been taught screamed at him to hold back. Standard U.S. fighter doctrine was explicit. Maintain altitude, wait for support, attack in coordinated formation. Lone attacks were discouraged for a reason. They exposed the pilot, wasted limited ammunition, and almost always ended badly. Doctrine existed to keep pilots alive long enough to fight again. But doctrine assumed time. And time was the one thing Adair didn't have. As the seconds ticked by, the distance between the bombers and Dinjan shrank. Adair understood the operational reality better than any manual ever could. Even if other fighters were scrambling now, they wouldn't reach altitude in time. By the time help arrived, the Japanese bombers would already be over the airfield, releasing their payloads onto parked transports, fuel dumps, and crowded ground crews. He had already seen what raids like that did. He knew what delay cost. In aircraft, in lives, and in the fragile supply chain keeping the entire theater alive. So the choice in front of him was brutally simple. He could preserve his life and obey doctrine, climb, circle, and wait for support that might never arrive in time. Or he could attack alone, break every rule he'd been taught, and try, just try, to disrupt the raid before it reached its target. One option almost guaranteed his survival. The other offered a slim chance of stopping the bombers and a very real chance of never coming back. In that instant, fear was there. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying. But hesitation, the thing that killed pilots faster than bullets, was gone. That had been burned out of him by training, by Burma, and by months of living under constant threat. The decision wasn't heroic in his mind. It was immediate, instinctive, necessary. Phillip Adair pushed the nose of his P-40 down. He didn't ease into the attack. He didn't probe the formation or test its edges. He dived directly and aggressively into the heart of it, committing himself fully. This wasn't how fighter pilots were supposed to fight. This violated every rule designed to keep a man alive in hostile skies. And once the dive began, there was no escape plan waiting on the other side. No guarantee of a second pass. No promise that he would ever climb out again. The moment he pushed the nose down, theory ended. What followed happened inside a swarm of enemy aircraft where survival depended on chaos. Inside the swarm, the impossible maneuver. Phillip Adair hit the Japanese formation at speed, with no finesse and no backup. Surprise was the only weapon he had left, and he used it immediately. One moment the escorts were settled into their layered positions, the next a single P-40 was tearing straight through the spacing between them, forcing reactions instead of allowing plans. His angle of attack was everything. Instead of skirting the edges of the formation, Adair cut straight through the escort screen, punching into the bomber boxes themselves. That choice mattered. Japanese bombers relied on disciplined formations to survive, overlapping defensive fire and mutual support. Once that geometry broke, their protection collapsed with it. Bombers began to separate, gunners losing coordinated arcs as pilots maneuvered to avoid collision and fire. Adair fired immediately. There was no time to aim carefully or conserve ammunition. His guns flashed as he closed, and at least one Japanese fighter went down in flames. Several bombers were hit as well, damaged enough to force evasive action, rather than a clean run toward Dinjan airfield. In the space of seconds, the formation went from orderly to reactive. The escorts responded exactly as doctrine dictated and exactly as Adair knew they would. Fighters dove on him from above, while others clawed upward from below, trying to trap him inside the formation. Tracer rounds filled the air, streaking past his canopy like burning wires. His P-40 took hits across the wings, through the fuselage and into the tail. Metal tore, control surfaces shuddered, and warning lights flickered. Any lesser pilot might have disengaged immediately. Adair didn't. Despite the damage, he stayed aggressive, making repeated passes through the broken formation. He refused to peel away while he still had ammunition. Each pass forced the Japanese pilots to keep reacting, turning, diving, climbing, instead of stabilizing for a bombing run. That mattered more than raw destruction. Bombers scattered further, spacing widened, and timing collapsed. What had been a coordinated strike package became a collection of individual aircraft trying to survive. This was the psychological fracture point. Bombing raids depended on precision and discipline. Once that was lost, effectiveness dropped sharply. Eventually, the limits caught up to him. His ammunition was gone. His aircraft was battered and barely holding together. Only then did Adair finally break away from the swarm, diving out of the chaos with what control he had left. And something unexpected happened. No escort pursued him effectively. The Japanese formation was already too disorganized, too scattered, too focused on regaining cohesion to mount a clean chase. The maneuver had worked. What Phillip Adair didn't know yet was that the real shock would come after he landed, when commanders realized what had just happened. The shockwave. What happened after he landed. Phillip Adair brought his P-40 back to base barely holding together. The aircraft that rolled to a stop on the dirt runway didn't look like something that should have flown, let alone survived a head-on encounter with an entire Japanese strike force. The wings were punctured, the fuselage was torn up, and the tail had taken hits that would have sent many aircraft spiraling out of control. Ground crews stared at it in disbelief. More than one person would later say the same thing. That plane shouldn't have made it back. Word spread fast across the airfield. Officers, mechanics, and pilots gathered around the battered Warhawk trying to piece together what had just happened. One aircraft, one pilot. against an entire raid that only minutes earlier had looked unstoppable. This wasn't how air defense was supposed to work, and yet there it was, sitting on the runway, engine ticking as it cooled. Then the reports started coming in. Combat assessments confirmed what nobody had dared to hope while the alarms were still echoing. The Japanese raid had been broken. The bombers failed to execute their attack on Dinjan airfield. No coordinated bomb run, no destruction of parked transports, no fuel dumps exploding. The timing had collapsed, the formation had scattered, and the moment was lost. The airfield and the supply routes it supported were still standing. Official tallies followed, the kind that history usually remembers. Adair was credited with 1 enemy fighter destroyed, along with multiple bombers and fighters damaged. On paper, those numbers were respectable, but they weren't what mattered most. The real result wasn't measured in kills, it was measured in what didn't happen. No runway cratered, no transport aircraft burning on the ground, no interruption to the fragile airlift over the Himalayas that kept the China-Burma-India theater alive. Command understood that immediately. This wasn't a lucky break or an inflated claim. This was a rare moment where individual action had altered the outcome of an entire engagement. Adair's decision to attack alone, against doctrine, against logic, against overwhelming odds, had bought time when time was everything. The response came quickly. Phillip Adair was awarded the Silver Star, recognizing not just bravery, but gallantry in action against an enemy in. Among fellow pilots, the story spread even faster than the paperwork. The mission became legendary, not because of a high kill count or a perfectly executed maneuver, but because of the decision itself. Pilots talked about that morning as proof that sometimes doctrine couldn't keep up with reality, that sometimes the rulebook ended and instinct took over. Adair went on to fly many more missions after December 13, 1943. He survived the war. He lived a full life. But that day in the skies over Assam defined his legacy. It was remembered as a moment when the system failed to provide an answer, and one pilot provided it anyway. This was not a miracle. It was what happened when one pilot, shaped by relentless pressure, refused to wait and changed the outcome of a battle in seconds. If stories like this remind you just how far courage can go, then don't let this be the last one you hear. Hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next unbelievable piece of history. And if you also have any crazy CBI stories, please drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.